The signal came through on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything in deep space, but Priya Solis had grown up marking time in Earth weeks, and old habits don't die just because you're sitting in a cold monitoring station, 400,000 kilometers above the planet you were born on. She had been at this post for 3 years. Her job, technically, was to log deep space radio anomalies. Her actual job, the one nobody wrote down anywhere, was to read alien mail. 11 years ago, when she was 14 and already bored out of her mind at every school they put her in, she had picked up a repeating signal in a frequency no Earth agency was officially monitoring. She didn't tell anyone at first. She just sat with it, worked it, pulled the pattern apart the way other kids pulled apart toys. 8 months later, she had the first fragments of a translation matrix. A year after that, she had a partial dictionary. At 16, she was reading Sovereignty Council announcements with roughly the accuracy of someone using a foreign phrase book badly, but getting the general idea. By the time anyone with authority found out what she'd done, it was too late to make her stop. So they gave her a station and told her to keep going. The signal that came through on that Tuesday was different. It was not a routine administrative broadcast. It was a vote record. Priya read it 3 times. Then she opened a channel to the committee. First Counselor Shen Adler was in a budget meeting when the alert came through. He looked at the one-line summary on his screen and ended the meeting without explanation. 12 minutes later, he was in a secure room with 4 other people, reading the full translation. The Galactic Sovereignty Council, 47 species, oldest interstellar body in this arm of the galaxy, the organization that had quietly been watching Earth for decades and saying nothing, had taken a vote. The subject of the vote was Earth. The result was unanimous. The word in the translation that Priya had flagged with 3 asterisks was one she'd learned early because it appeared in sovereignty records more than almost any other word. It meant removal, permanent, no appeal mechanism. No timeline given for reconsideration, because there was no reconsideration. Earth had been marked for destruction. Shen read the document once and did not speak for a long time. Someone in the room asked if the translation could be wrong. Priya's voice came through the speaker. She was patched in remotely, and she said no, it could not. What followed was not panic. That was the thing that surprised everyone who heard about it later, when the story could finally be told. There was no panic. There was a very short meeting, and then Shen Adler picked up a different phone and made a call to a woman named Admiral Dara Akafer. Dara was already awake. She had been awake for 6 hours because her own signals team had pulled the same broadcast, and she had not waited for anyone to tell her what it said. She had her own translators. She had been building toward this for 7 years. "Same read on our end," she said when Shen's call connected. "How long do you need?" "I don't need anything. We're ready." Shen was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think it would actually happen." "I did," Dara said. She was not being cold about it. She had simply spent 7 years wargaming the exact scenario that had just become real, and cold was the wrong word for someone who had already done all their grieving about a possibility and come out the other side into something steadier. The Sovereignty's enforcement armada, according to the intercepted transmission, had received its deployment orders at 300 station time. That gave Earth a window, not a large one, but Dara had not built her fleet for a large window. She had built it for the exact size of window they actually had. At 600, the ISV Relentless and 31 other human warships jumped out of Earth's shadow and into deep space. Nobody on Earth's surface saw them go. The launches had been staged over 6 weeks from positions on the far side of the moon. No broadcast, no announcement, no ceremony. On the bridge of the Relentless, Ryo Nader checked his systems and said nothing. He had known this day was coming the same way you know a storm is coming when you've been watching the sky long enough. You stop being surprised by it. You just check your gear. The galaxy had voted to erase a species it had never spoken to, had never warned, had never given the chance to answer for the things it feared in them. The species in question had been listening the whole time. The fleet moved. Behind them, Earth turned in the dark, quiet and blue and completely unaware of what was about to happen in its name. Fleet Warden Goss had spent 40 years in the Sovereignty Enforcement Armada, and in those 40 years he had escorted colony disputes, suppressed 3 minor species uprisings, and overseen the decommissioning of 2 worlds that had failed the Council's habitability standards. He was not a man who expected surprises. He had read the Earth file. Per-contact species, early space travel, high aggression indices, threat classification category 3. The mission brief said to expect orbital debris, a handful of primitive satellites, maybe 1 or 2 crewed vessels in low orbit. He was told to treat them like you treat any category 3 removal, fast, clean, no extended contact. What he found in Sector 7 Gamma was 32 warships arranged in a blocking formation across the only viable approach vector to Earth. They were not scrambling to intercept him. They were not emitting distress signals or broadcasting demands. They were simply sitting there in a formation that took his tactical officer 4 minutes to analyze because the formation was not random. It was optimal. Every ship was placed to cover the maximum firing angle with minimum exposure. Whoever had arranged them knew what they were doing. Goss stood at his command console and looked at the sensor display for a long time without speaking. His second-in-command, a young officer named Ferris, asked if they should hold position. Goss said yes. The human transmission came 40 seconds later. No build-up, no static, no greeting. Just a voice, calm, direct, slightly tired-sounding, identifying herself as Admiral Dara Akafer of Earth's 1st Expeditionary Fleet. She said the Armada had entered contested space. She said Earth considered this an act of war. Then she gave coordinates not for a battle but for a meeting point and went quiet. She did not ask if the coordinates were acceptable. Goss recorded the transmission and forwarded it to Council Station Orange 7 with a single line of his own. The Earth file is wrong. The response from Ambassador Tor took longer than Goss expected. When it came, it was dismissive. The formation was probably automated. The transmission was probably looped. No per-contact species could have built that kind of fleet in secret. Goss should proceed with the mission. Goss looked at the 32 ships on his screen and thought about what the word probably was worth in a tactical situation. Then he forwarded Tor a secondary analysis his team had just completed. The human vessels were not automated. Their drive signatures showed active life support, active power cores, active weapon systems in standby mode. The formation adjustments over the past hour were too precise for automated response. There were people on those ships, a lot of them. Tor's next message authorized a formal meeting, neutral ground. He called it a chance to let the humans surrender gracefully. Goss did not reply to that part. The meeting station was Drea 4. A small resupply post sitting equidistant between the 2 fleets. Goss chose 2 officers to accompany him and kept the rest of the Armada at holding position. He filed a formal status report before he left, noting that engagement without additional intelligence would be premature. He also privately ran an exercise in his head on the way to Drea 4. He had done this his whole career, mentally walked through an engagement before it happened, tested his assumptions. He did it now. His Armada against the human fleet. The blocking formation, the weapons geometry, the positioning. He ran it twice. Both times, his losses were higher than any mission briefing had ever suggested were possible against a Category 3 species. He stopped running the exercise after the second time. On the human fleet's flagship, Ryo Nader watched the Armadas holding position on his display and felt the particular silence of a ship at battle readiness. Every person at their post, nothing moving faster than it needed to. He had sailed in quieter seas, but not many. Priya Solis was at her station, running the translation feed live. The Sovereignty internal communications were still broadcasting, and she was still reading them. She noted, without passing it to anyone yet, that Liaison Officer Venn, a minor bureaucrat whose name appeared in the early Earth monitoring files, had just been summoned to an emergency council session. She pulled his file. He was the first sovereignty official to flag humanity's expanding orbital presence 8 years ago. His report had recommended immediate contact. The Council had classified it and done nothing. She added that to the record. Everything went to the record. Dara's shuttle crossed to Drea 4 with minimal crew. She brought Shen Adler, Ryo Nader, and Priya Solis. No security. Priya carried a data tablet. When the docking clamps locked on and the airlock pressure equalized, Goss was already waiting on the other side. He looked at the 4 humans for a moment. They were smaller than he expected, from a purely physical standpoint. The file had given him height and mass averages, but something about reading numbers was different from seeing the actual people. Dara Akafer looked at him the same way he was looking at her, measuring, not hostile, just clear-eyed. Goss said, in translated standard, that he was glad no one had started shooting. Dara said she was glad too. It was the most honest exchange either of them would have for the next several hours. The conference room on Drea 4 was meant for cargo negotiations. It had a long table, mismatched chairs borrowed from 3 different species furniture standards, and a ventilation unit that made a soft ticking sound every 40 seconds. Nobody mentioned the sound. Everyone noticed it. Ambassador Tor had brought 11 people: legal advisors, translation specialists, a sovereignty protocol officer whose only job was to ensure proper diplomatic form was observed, and 2 security personnel who stood near the door and tried to look neutral. The table was arranged to give the sovereignty side more room. That had been deliberate. Tor understood space as language. Shen Adler sat down across from him and did not appear to notice the arrangement. Tor opened with the standard sovereignty framework for species review proceedings. He had done this 4 times before, always with civilizations that were desperate and grateful for the chance to speak at all. He explained that the Council's decision was under review, that Earth's status was being reconsidered in light of new information, and that the humans were welcome to present a case for reconsideration. He used the word welcome twice. It was the diplomatic equivalent of asking someone to beg politely. Shen listened to the whole thing. He let the translator run. He did not take notes. When Tor finished, Shen put his hands flat on the table and asked one question. He asked whether the sovereignty's own charter, specifically Article 9 of the Contact Protocols, required a full council consensus for a removal order targeting a non-contacted species, or whether a simple majority was sufficient. Tor's protocol officer leaned in and whispered something. Tor's expression did not change, but his posture shifted slightly. The answer was consensus. The vote had not been consensus. It had been a majority, with 6 council members dissenting. Those 6 had been overruled and their objections sealed under internal classification. Priya opened her tablet and set it on the table. She had the full council debate indexed by speaker, by timestamp, by topic. She pulled up the 6 dissenting members' arguments and read 2 of them aloud in clean, fluent sovereignty standard. Her accent was odd, but her grammar was exact. Tor's translation specialist looked at her with an expression that had no diplomatic category for it. One of the sealed arguments she read had been filed by a council member named Adora, from a species called the Veltian. Adora had argued that humanity's orbital expansion was not aggression, it was exploration, and that the Council was misclassifying curiosity as threat because the outcome of curiosity and the outcome of aggression looked similar on a sensor scan. The argument had been dismissed in under 10 minutes. Adora had filed a formal objection to the dismissal. That had also been classified. Tor said the sealed records were not admissible in the current proceedings. Shen said he understood, and that was why he was not presenting them as evidence. He was reading them aloud from his own records, which were not covered by sovereignty classification, because Earth was not a sovereignty member, and therefore not subject to sovereignty information controls. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of Tor's legal advisors said something in rapid sovereignty dialect that the translator rendered only partially, but the partial version included the word impossible, referring to the fact that Earth should not have had access to sealed council records. Priya looked up from her tablet. She explained, briefly and without drama, that Earth had been intercepting and decrypting sovereignty transmissions for 11 years. She said it the way someone mentions what they had for lunch. Just information, offered in the appropriate context. The Sovereignty Protocol officer stood up. He said this was a violation of sovereignty communication sovereignty, an actual legal term, and that the proceedings were invalid. Shen said he was happy to discuss that issue, and that if the council wished to file a formal complaint about the interception, they were welcome to, and that Earth would respond through whatever official diplomatic channel the council would like to establish. Since this was apparently the first time the two parties were talking, and someone needed to open a channel anyway. Nobody stood up after that. Tor looked at Shen for a long moment. He was trying to find the angle. Every species he had dealt with in 40 years of diplomacy had an angle, something they wanted, something they were afraid of, something that could be used to shape the conversation toward the outcome he needed. He was looking for humanity's version of that. Shen Adler had no angle visible. He looked like a man who had come to the table having already decided what was acceptable and what wasn't, and was simply waiting to find out which category this conversation fell into. Tor called a recess. Outside in the corridor, while his team spoke in fast, low voices, he stood apart and looked through a narrow viewport at the two fleets sitting in the dark. 32 human ships. 32. He had not known they existed 3 days ago. He did not know what else he didn't know. That was the part that bothered him most. Not the ships, not the decryption, not the legal argument about Article 9. It was the simple fact that Earth had been watching his council for 11 years, reading their mail, taking notes, building a fleet in response to a vote they had correctly predicted, and nobody on the council had noticed. He had a file on humanity that called them unpredictable. He was starting to think the file had it backwards. The request for a private channel came through at 2140 station time, addressed directly to the ISV Relentless. No sovereignty header, no diplomatic routing code. Just a calm request logged under Fleet Warden Goss's personal authorization ID. Ryo Nader flagged it to Dara, who read the request, thought about it for 4 seconds and said to accept. The channel opened without video, just audio and a small amount of background static that told Dara his ship was running signal scrubbers, no recording on his end. She was recording on hers. She told him so immediately, because honesty at this stage was more useful than strategy. Goss said he didn't mind. He asked if she would actually fight, not as a threat, not as a negotiating position. He wanted a real answer because he was a military officer and real answers were what he built plans around. Dara told him yes. She said it without pausing to consider whether it was wise to say it. There was no point pretending otherwise. He had censored data on her fleet and she had censored data on his, and anyone doing the math knew the first exchange would be brutal on both sides. Goss was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had run the engagement models. Twice. He didn't say what the results were. He didn't need to. The fact that he was on this channel told her something about what the models showed. He asked her why Earth had never made contact. Not the political version of that question. He didn't want the prepared answer. He wanted to know why, actually, a species that had been reading sovereignty communications for over a decade had never simply sent a message. Dara told him to pull the early Earth monitoring reports from the Council archive, the ones filed in the first 3 years of observation. She asked him to look specifically at the language used to describe human behavior, the words the early assessment teams chose, the threat categories they assigned, the assumptions they made about what human space activity meant. She said, "We read those reports too. We saw how your council looked at us before we'd done anything except build radio telescopes and send probes to our own neighboring planets. We knew what diplomatic contact would have triggered, so we didn't contact you. We prepared instead." Goss didn't respond to that right away. Dara waited. She was good at waiting. When he spoke again, he asked her something different. He asked about the crew of the Relentless, average age, tour length, whether they were volunteers. It was an odd question for the moment, and she almost said so. Instead, she told him. Average age was 29, most had signed on for 2-year tour, all of them volunteers, and the waiting list to serve on an expeditionary vessel was longer than the vessels could absorb. He said people volunteered for this. She said yes. He said, knowing they might not come back. She said they knew, they came anyway. Another silence. This one felt different from the first one. Goss told her carefully that the sovereignty had not produced volunteer military service in over 200 years. Every enforcement crew was contracted, compensated, and reassigned after service. The idea of someone choosing this without a financial structure behind the choice was not something the Armada's psychological assessment models had a category for. Dara said she wasn't sure it was something you could model. He asked if that was a criticism of the sovereignty. She said no, it was just a difference. Differences weren't automatically criticisms. Goss said he appreciated that. He said it in the kind of tone that meant he actually did, not the kind that meant he was being polite. Then he told her something he probably shouldn't have. He said that 3 members of his command staff had independently come to him in the past 18 hours and asked whether the mission was still valid given what they'd found in Sector 7 Gamma. Not refusing orders, just asking the question. He said he hadn't had that happen before in 40 years. Dara asked what he told them. He said he told them to hold position and trust the process. He said it with just enough weight that she understood he was not entirely satisfied with his own answer. She didn't push on it. That wasn't the kind of conversation where pushing worked. She just noted it and moved on. She asked him one thing before the channel closed. She asked whether he thought the destruction order was the right call, genuinely, as someone who had read the Earth file and now had live sensor data on a human fleet and was standing in the same hour as the situation. Goss said no comment. Dara said she understood. The channel closed at 22:19. 12 minutes later, Goss filed a formal military objection to the active deployment order. Not a refusal, just a procedural block citing insufficient intelligence on target capability, which was technically true and also happened to be one of only 3 mechanisms under sovereignty military law that could pause a deployment without requiring direct council authorization. The Armada held. On the Relentless, Priya Solis pulled the filing the moment it hit the sovereignty internal network and read it twice. Then she walked to Dara's quarters and slid a printed copy under the door without knocking, because the Admiral was sleeping and had left orders not to be disturbed, and because the document would still mean the same thing in the morning. It meant they had time, not much, but more than 0. That was enough. At 400 station time, while the Sovereignty Council was in emergency session, and the Armada was sitting at holding position, and everyone with authority was arguing about what to do next, Priya Solis did something nobody had authorized. She released everything. Not a summary, not a curated selection, everything. 11 years of intercepted sovereignty communications, indexed and searchable, uploaded simultaneously to every public diplomatic archive in the Sovereignty Network and 14 independent interstellar news channels. The original signals, the decrypted text, the translation notes, Priya's own annotation files showing how the decryption was built. All of it. The release package included, in the first 10 files, 4 things in a specific order. First, the original Earth monitoring reports from the early observation period, the ones that classified humanity as Category 3 threat based almost entirely on historical aggression patterns rather than observed current behavior. Second, the dissenting opinions from the 6 council members who voted against the removal order, including Adora's unsealed full argument. Third, the internal council debate transcripts showing how the dissenting reports were classified, and the dissenting members were procedurally overruled. Fourth, Liaison Officer Ven's original report from 8 years ago recommending immediate diplomatic contact, and the response from the council office that told him to reclassify it and forget about it. Then, when he found out his report was now publicly available across 1,100 sovereignty member worlds, sat in a chair in a corridor of Oran 7 station and put his face in his hands. It was not distress, exactly. He had written that report in good faith, filed it correctly, and spent 8 years being quietly certain that someone had read it and decided he was wrong. Seeing it in public felt less like exposure, and more like being told that the thing he'd known for 8 years was actually true. The reaction across sovereignty space was not simple. Nothing this complicated ever produced a simple reaction. A significant number of species were alarmed, and their response was exactly what Tor had predicted humanity would trigger: the argument that a precontact species had infiltrated sovereignty communications, built a covert military, and positioned itself as an adversary before any dialogue had occurred. This group wanted the removal order reinstated. They were loud. But they were not alone in the conversation, and that was the part nobody in the council had planned for. Several species, including 3 of the 6 whose representatives had dissented on the vote, reacted to the release with something closer to vindication. The Veltian Council put out a statement within 6 hours saying that the documents confirmed what their representative Adora had argued, and that the removal order had never been procedurally valid. The Halori Collective, a small but diplomatically active species known for meticulous record-keeping, announced that they were opening an independent review of the Council's classification protocols based on the released materials. The Drini, who had no direct stake in the Earth situation but were deeply interested in intelligence methodology, began publicly discussing how a single precontact species had cracked sovereignty encryption within a decade. That conversation went in a direction the Council's Signals Division found very uncomfortable. Inside the Council chamber, Tor learned about the release mid-session and spent 40 seconds completely still before saying anything. He said, eventually, that the release was an act of sabotage and that the Council should treat it as such. The Halori representative asked how a species that was not a sovereignty member could be held to sovereignty information law. Tor did not have a clean answer to that. The session ran for 9 hours. Twice it nearly collapsed into procedural deadlock. Twice, the Halori representative and 1 other member called for a formal recess and talked specific delegates back into their seats. What shifted the room in the end was not an argument. It was a number. Gauss's military objection had cited insufficient intelligence on target capability. Someone ran the actual numbers, cross-referencing the human fleet's observed specifications against the Armada's deployment strength, and distributed the analysis to all 47 council members simultaneously. The analysis was 4 pages. The conclusion was 1 sentence, which said that in a direct engagement under current conditions, the outcome was not predictable with confidence. A removal order that could not be executed predictably was, under Council doctrine, an invalid removal order. The vote for a formal review passed 26 to 21. The destruction order was suspended pending review, not cancelled, suspended. The distinction mattered to the people who had voted for it, so the Council let them have it. On the Relentless, Priya was in her bunk when the vote result came through. She had been awake for 31 hours and had fallen asleep with her data tablet on her chest. Ryo Nader, who had been on the bridge when the result came through, sent her a 1-line message. She read it when she woke up 4 hours later. The message said it worked. Priya read it, set the tablet face down on the bunk, and looked at the ceiling for a while. It was a strange feeling, not victory, not relief exactly. More like the particular quiet that comes after you've been bracing for something for a very long time and the thing doesn't happen. The muscles don't know how to stop tensing right away. She lay there until the feeling passed. Then she got up and went back to work. There were still 21 council members who had voted against the review. That meant 21 who still thought the removal order was the right call. 21 was not nothing. She kept reading the mail. The review took 19 days. In sovereignty terms, that was very fast. In practical terms, it meant 19 days of the human fleet holding position in Sector 7 Gamma, running crew rotations, eating rations, and waiting for 47 species to finish arguing about something that humanity had no vote in. Dara ran daily briefings. She kept the ship's routines normal maintenance schedules, training drills, meal times. Routine was its own kind of message to a crew. It said, "We are not panicking," it said, "We expected this." On day 14, Tor made a move nobody had expected. He requested a second meeting at Drea 4, not through official diplomatic channels but through a direct message to Shen Adler marked personal and not for record. He did not bring 11 people this time. He brought 2. He told Shen, without preamble, that the review was going to produce a result that neither side would like. He said the majority position was moving toward provisional status, a classification that was not removal but was not recognition either. Earth would be observed, restricted, kept at arm's length. He said he was telling Shen this because Shen had told him things off the record during the recess at the first meeting, small things, factual things about how Earth had made its decisions. He said he found that kind of directness easier to work with than what he usually encountered. Shen asked what Tor actually wanted. Tor said he wanted to know whether humanity would accept the provisional classification or reject it, because if Earth rejected it and pushed for full recognition, the vote would go the wrong way and the removal order would come back. And this time, the political conditions in the council were different from 12 days ago. This time it might pass with enough margin to override a military objection. Shen thought about it. He did not call Dara, which surprised Tor. He just sat with the question. He told Tor, Earth would accept the provisional status. Not because it was fair, it wasn't. Not because humanity was satisfied with it, they weren't. But because the difference between provisional status and a renewed removal order was the difference between time and no time, and humans had proven very good at using time productively. Tor looked at him for a moment. He said, "That is either very wise or very dangerous." Shen said probably both. The formal result came through on day 19. Conditional sovereignty status, provisional, subject to 5-year review. A set of restricted zones where human vessels were not permitted without notification. A requirement for Earth to register any future spacecraft capable of deep space travel. And an acknowledgement, buried in the secondary clauses but there, that the original removal order had been procedurally irregular. Shen signed the agreement in a room by himself, with 2 witnesses and no ceremony. He thanked the sovereignty representative who delivered it. The thank you was brief. The representative seemed vaguely unsettled by how brief it was, as if he had expected something more. The fleet received its withdrawal orders and began the return sequence. Ships jumped out of Sector 7 Gamma in groups of 4, quiet and efficient. No broadcasts, no announcements. Before the last group jumped, Dara opened a direct line to Gauss and transmitted a single file. No words attached, just coordinates. The coordinates pointed to an area of space on the far outer edge of the sovereignty's monitored region. Gauss pulled the sensor record for those coordinates going back 3 years. The data showed, faintly but consistently, drive signatures consistent with human vessel design. A second fleet, not deployed, just present, watching. It had been there for 3 years. Through every council debate about the Earth problem, every internal discussion, every strategy session about the removal order, there had been a second human fleet sitting in the dark at the edge of everything, watching and saying nothing. Gauss sat with that information for a long time. He didn't file it anywhere. He just sat with it. On Earth, the population went about its business. There was no announcement. The committee had not released anything publicly. Most people had no idea their planet had almost been destroyed, or that it had been saved by a fleet they'd never heard of, and an intelligence operation run initially by a 14-year-old. Priya put in her transfer request the day after the withdrawal was complete. Deep Space Survey Mission, assigned to map an uncharted region past the sovereignty's outer boundary. She was approved in under an hour, which she suspected had something to do with Dara signing off on it personally. Ryo Nader took the Relentless on patrol, same route as before, different context. The ship felt the same, the stars looked the same, the work was the same. Something was different, though. He couldn't name it exactly. It was the way people in the corridors carried themselves, not proud, not relieved, just settled. Like something that had been held tight for a long time had been allowed to relax slightly, not because the problem was over, but because they had made it to the next stage, which was better than where they'd been. Liaison Officer Ven filed a formal request to be reassigned away from Earth monitoring. The request was granted. His replacement had read his original report and found it useful as a baseline. They used it as a template for how to approach a newly contacted species, with curiosity, not assumption. Ven didn't know that. He was already on his way somewhere else finally. In the Sovereignty Archive, his 8-year-old report had been reclassified from suppressed to reference status. The notation on the new classification said, "Accurate assessment of observed subject. No further comment." The galaxy was watching Earth now, carefully, openly, not sure what it was looking at. Earth kept building ships.